I'd like to thank everyone for joining us this morning or this evening, as it seems is the case for most people on the call. It's an interesting thing to be talking about PICO for synthesis to people who are such experienced review methodologists. It feels like a very simple concept, and I think in the writing of the handbook chapters, we had a slightly light bulb moment where we realised that maybe we had not been thinking about PICO in the way that perhaps we might do in planning our protocol more usefully. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. My declarations, the main thing to say is that I'm employed at Cochrane Australia, which means that I'm funded by the Australian government to do systematic reviews, to support the conduct of reviews, to conduct methodological research. And I also receive funding from our government to undertake methodological reviews of other people's reviews. So most of my time is spent in the world of systematic reviews. Finally, I am obviously a co-author on 4 chapters of the new Cochrane Handbook. So the concept of PICO for synthesis is first introduced in chapter 2 of the handbook, but we have some much more detailed guidance about how to think about a PICO for synthesis in chapter 3, and that's going to be the focus of what I'll talk about. I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors on this chapter, Jo Mackenzie, who led the chapter, Rebecca Ryan, Hilary Thompson and Renee Johnson, who each brought really important perspectives from their editorial roles. And James Thomas, who had the unenviable job of knitting together the new material we'd written about PICO for synthesis with the updated guidance on eligibility criteria. Aware as I was that I would need to wake up my brain, I thought I might start with a little bit of history about how we came to this concept of PICO for synthesis, or at least how it came to be in the handbook. It really began back in 2011 at the Madrid Methods Symposium, where Jo Mackenzie first aired the ideas on other synthesis methods, and these became what now is chapter 12 of the handbook. In planning chapter 12, we had a teleconference with Jackie Chandler, who many of you will know was a great one for getting us all into action in writing our various contributions to the handbook. And in the course of a Skype call with Jackie, Jackie just casually asked the question about how the second chapter was going, which came as a bit of a shock to us really, because we were not really aware that there was a second chapter. So this was the first in a series of events that ultimately led me to be here speaking about this topic today. We developed an outline for this second chapter, which was on preparing for synthesis, and dutifully sent that off to Julian and Tianjin. And in the course of that, they added a heading without much fanfare called Articulating the PICO for Synthesis. This led to quite a lot of deliberation amongst our author team, and by 2017, we were still at a bit of a loss as to what to write under this heading of PICO for synthesis without actually just copying the chapter on eligibility criteria. Many hours of debate and a lot of consternation later, we've managed to come up with 9,000 words on the topic and 17 pages of tables. So unsurprisingly, that was met with possibly stunned silence. I don't think Julian and Tianjin ever had quite imagined that their subheading would lead to such a verbose response. And by late 2018, we were still in a position where we were starting to worry that PICO for synthesis and all those words were going to end up in the bin. So we initiated a conference call with Julian and James to alleviate our anxiety. And in the course of that call, rather than hearing that this concept was going to be in the bin, we heard James say, there's some useful stuff in here. We like the work on PICO for synthesis. We've put that bit in chapters 2 and 3. And so it is that by 2009, we had ended up with 4 contributions to 4 chapters rather than 1. But more importantly, the concept of PICO for synthesis was appearing in the handbook for the first time. So now in the handbook, we have defined 3 levels of PICO. The very familiar review PICO, which is planned at the protocol stage and on which the eligibility of studies is based. This new concept of PICO for synthesis, planned at the protocol stage, and which defines the question that each synthesis aims to answer, and the PICO of included studies, which is determined at the review stage and which defines the questions investigated in the included studies. So PICO really needs no introduction to a group of experienced review authors, and yet I am going to talk about it in a little bit more detail because I think there's quite an important distinction between the PICO for the review and a PICO for synthesis that's worth thinking about. We all know that PICO defines the questions that we ask in a review. Questions such as, does exercise increase bone density in postmenopausal women? What is the comparative efficacy and acceptability of different psychological therapies for panic disorder? And what is the effect of psychosocial interventions for supporting women to stop smoking in pregnancy? It's a very useful construct. Our PICO for the review allows us to examine the PICO characteristics of the included studies identified by our search and determine which of these studies are eligible for the review. And we all throw our arms up in horror if we happen to come across a so-called systematic review that hasn't defined the PICO for their review. It really is an essential element of our reviews. But if we think a little bit more about the questions we answer, well, really they're determined by the synthesis that we do in our review. So if we were to examine a review with a PICO of does exercise increase bone density in postmenopausal women, we would expect a meta-analysis that includes any type of exercise. What we find in this review is, in fact, that we have multiple meta-analyses looking at 4 different categories of exercise. And these vary depending on whether they're weight-bearing or not and the amount of force exerted. Looking in more detail at the studies, what we see is that those 4 categories of exercise include diverse and overlapping interventions. For example, weightlifting appears in 3 out of the 4 categories of intervention. And this raises the question of what are the intervention characteristics or the criteria that differentiate each of these groups. It's these characteristics or criteria that are part of our PICO for synthesis, obviously in this case focusing on the eye or the intervention of the PICO. They allow us to examine the PICO characteristics of each of our included studies and decide which of these studies are eligible for each synthesis. And what occurred to us in the writing of this chapter is that while we often see very detailed specification of the PICO for the review, it's less common that we see sufficiently detailed specification of the PICO for each synthesis to allow replication of these decisions. A PICO for synthesis will ideally be sufficiently detailed to allow us to determine whether each of these interventions is weight-bearing and low force, for example, and whether or not they're similar enough to combine in a synthesis. So should we be pre-specifying our PICO for each synthesis? This was certainly something that has caused quite a lot of controversy between our authors on the handbook chapter because there is a feeling that this is actually quite a difficult ask. But ideally, we think the answer is yes, and that's why we've gone to the extent that we have in writing the guidance in the handbook chapter. The importance of specification of the PICO will vary by reviews. We certainly acknowledge that, but we also think there's almost always some important variance that people come across when they go to do their review. So if we take interventions as an example, something that may be as seemingly straightforward as a pharmaceutical will almost inevitably have variations of dose and duration of treatment. And authors will have to make decisions about how they handle those differences in their review. So this slide really harks back to many of the points that James made about the reasons why we pre-specify our methods in protocols. Why should we specify PICO for synthesis? Well, we can think of 3 main reasons. The first is to minimise bias and increase reproducibility. The second, to improve interpretation. And the third, to increase the utility of the review for decision makers. So thinking about bias and reproducibility, the way in which studies are grouped for synthesis influences the findings. We know that. A decision to include a study or not in a given meta-analysis or another synthesis will change the result and possibly change the conclusion. So careful planning of groups may help us avoid decisions that are influenced by the findings of individual studies and increase the reproducibility of those findings. In terms of improving interpretation, well, a well-defined PICO for synthesis provides a standardised terminology for both the interventions and outcomes. And this may help us overcome the varied description used by study authors, which can actually make it very difficult to decide which studies should be in each synthesis and to interpret the results. It enables comparison and synthesis of the PICO characteristics across studies, and it's actually an important synthesis task which is often not talked about. And it provides a consistent language for reporting that aids interpretation. And finally, specifying our PICO for synthesis may help ensure that we make best use of available data and that we produce a review focused on questions relevant to decision makers. And that's especially the case if those decision makers are involved at the planning stage of the review. So to aid this process, we've identified a process for planning a PICO for each synthesis. This really, in this process, we're suggesting steps and decision points at each step. Really what we're trying to do here is to capture the behind the scene work that we know authors are already doing. It's not intended to be prescriptive. It may be an iterative process. In fact, it's likely to be so. And some of the steps in the process are likely to be done concurrently. It includes principles for developing a flexible plan that maximises the potential to synthesise, because we're very aware that often people have these ambitious aims to answer quite specific questions in their review, and they find an absence of data to do so or a lack of studies to do useful synthesis at that level. So we're suggesting some approaches that might help overcome that. There's a process for planning intervention groups for synthesis, and a similar one for planning outcome groups for synthesis. And I'll finish there. I think this topic raises many questions, particularly around the extent to which it's feasible to pre-specify, but I think it's a really important conversation for us to have.